Hey, I'm Sapphire. Want to hear something scary? Before we head into our next chapter, make sure you subscribe to Snarled and turn on the bell for notifications. This next story comes from Zen in Colorado, who had a close encounter with a dangerous creature you may have heard of. When Zen was around 6 years old, she lived deep in the mountains of Colorado. Her family had no internet and no cell phone coverage. They lived in isolation from the rest of the world, and liked it that way. Zen spent most of her days outside, playing in the forest that surrounded her house. Her only company up there was her 2 huge Saint Bernards. One day, Zen was playing in the forest with her dogs. She realized she wandered a little too far when she looked behind her and couldn't see her house anymore. She found herself in a clearing where there were piles of strange sticks strewn around. Little did Zen know at the time, but they weren't sticks at all. She looked up. Huge rain clouds had started to form and the wind picked up speed. A storm was coming and she needed to get back inside. Zen started to head in the direction that she thought was home. With every step, the wind's power increased. The leaves from the trees were swirling around her and little droplets of rain sprinkled on top of her. She walked for what seemed like forever. And then she heard it, rustling in the trees. It was coming from the trees in front of her. Zen became super uneasy. She felt like someone was watching her. Then her dogs started to growl and bark. They stood in front of her, protecting her. A twig snapped and her dogs lost it. She had never seen them act this way. Then, a voice called out from the trees. It was her mother's. "Zenny?" the voice said. "Zenny? Mom?" Zen wanted to be comforted by this. She should have been comforted by this, but she couldn't. That was her nickname and that was her mother's voice, but it sounded off. It's like when you pull on a record and the words are slow and mumbled.
"Come here,"
the voice shouted again. That was definitely not Zen's mother. She began to run, her dogs barking the entire way. But she stopped when she saw those familiar sticks. She had run the wrong way. "Zenny, come here. Zenny, here, Zenny, Zenny, come here." The voice had followed her. She took off in the other direction, not stopping for a second until finally, her house! She ran inside and after she caught her breath, told her mother what happened. She assured her that it was probably just the wind howling in the trees and nothing more. It wasn't until years later, after Zen and her family had moved from that house, that Zen decided to ask her mother about that day. "Mom, do you remember our old house and that day when I heard your voice in the forest?" "Oh, yeah." Her brow furrowed as she contemplated her next words. "I guess you're old enough now to know the truth." "The truth about what?" "When you told me about the voices in the trees, I didn't want to scare you at the time because you were so young. That house was on Native American land. I called a medicine man to come and cleanse our house and property. When I told him your story, he said that you were very lucky to be alive. You had narrowly escaped a Wendigo. A Wendigo is a demonic spirit that possesses humans and turns them into cannibals. They have an insatiable hunger for human flesh and will stop at nothing to get it. Wendigos are vicious, but also very cunning and tricky. With their heightened sense of hearing, they can pick up the panicked heartbeat of a lost human from miles away. Then, with their long legs and supernatural speed, they run over to their prey and begin their twisted game. Sometimes, they taunt their victims with their deep growls. Other times, they'll mimic human voices of loved ones to trick you into coming closer.
"Come here."
According to legend, a Wendigo is nearly impossible to escape. Once it's made you its target, you're as good as dead. To this day, Zen still can't believe that she is one of the lucky few to have escaped the clutches of a Wendigo. It was 2010, and Anastasia was 7 years old. One day, her father told the family about a lovely cabin in the mountains of Colorado, which his friend rented out year-round. It was pretty far from any major roads and tucked away in a grove. There was a rushing river and a waterfall. He wanted to visit in the wintertime, and her mother thought it was a great idea too, and so they planned a short vacation at the cabin. When they first arrived, Anastasia had a strange feeling about the house. Something just felt wrong, like the feeling you have when you walk into the wrong room and then you realize you walked in on something you didn't want to see. Anastasia first noticed the fireplace in the lounge. Above it was a creepy portrait of someone with piercing blue eyes who looked very important. She shook the feeling off, telling herself that the whole haunted cabin story was just a cliche and nothing more. Up the stairs was the bedroom she and her sister would share. It had 2 bunk beds right next to one another, the ladders across from each other. The ladders were extremely heavy, so their mom tightly secured them so they wouldn't wobble. The only other rooms upstairs were the bathroom and the balcony. The bathroom also had a strange vibe to it, so Anastasia used the downstairs bathroom. And the balcony was completely blocked off, which made her a little curious. Nighttime came, and as she and her sister got ready for bed, Anastasia's bad feeling about the cabin got much worse. She went downstairs to find a different room to sleep in, leaving her sister alone. Anastasia decided to sleep with her mother in one of the extra bedrooms. It was the only bedroom that felt different from the rest of the house. No weird vibes or energy. She felt like she could fall asleep there. There was a scrapbook on the bedside table, and her mom picked it up and flipped through it. There were photos of the property before the cabin was built, along with progress photos of the construction. They made this entire place by hand, she mentioned, in awe, although Anastasia wondered why she had a worried look on her face. Anastasia was able to sleep comfortably through the night with no strange occurrences. And then the morning came. She and her mom walked into the kitchen to make breakfast and paused. Every single cabinet in the kitchen was open about 45 degrees. There was shattered glass all over the floor, and yet none of the windows or doors were broken. The glass had seemingly come from nowhere. The snow flurried outside. Her sister was still asleep. What happened last night? They decided to sweep up the glass and close all the cabinets and forget about it. Although Anastasia noticed her mom had that same worried look as the night before. Later that night, Anastasia and her mom were getting ready for bed when her mom told her about what happened earlier that day. Her dad was telling her mom and sister to go check out the river because it was beautiful. They walked outside, and her mom was about 2 feet from the edge of the river. It was roaring violently. Suddenly, she felt a push on her back and stumbled forward. She fell onto the ground and clung onto the grass so she wouldn't be swept away in the current. She stood up, brushed the frost off, and yelled, "Why did you do that?" But when she turned around, no one was behind her. Anastasia's father and sister were already back in the cabin. Anastasia could see the same worry in her mother's eyes as she told her this story. They woke up the next morning to another strange discovery. There were peculiar white marks all along the floor. It looked as if someone had tracked in white paint. They began in the middle of the kitchen and ended at the fireplace. How the hell did that get in here? Later that day, Anastasia's sister tried to convince her to sleep in the bunk bed room with her. Anastasia continued to refuse, but to make her sister feel better, she told her that she'd come play with her before bedtime. Her sister was standing at the foot of the bunk bed ladder, and Anastasia was telling her something while climbing it. That's when the ladder began to move. Her sister wasn't touching it. She was halfway up when the ladder had straightened all on its own before falling backwards. Anastasia was thrust into the other ladder, and her arm was crushed under the weight. They drove to the nearest doctor, which wasn't for a few miles. As it turned out, the ladder had chipped away a part of Anastasia's arm bone, and it was now broken. They all returned to the cabin and decided to cut the vacation short and leave first thing in the morning. Her mom went into the hot tub outside to de-stress, and Anastasia sat on the edge to dip her feet while they talked. A long silence passed, and Anastasia noticed her mom staring out at the edge of the river. There, she saw a young lady with long brown hair wearing a green striped shirt. She'd never seen her before. She walked around the side of the house and Anastasia got up and followed her. But when she reached the corner, no one was there. They left the next morning and never returned. It wasn't until 6 years later that she was told the full story by her dad's friend, the owner of the cabin. There was a mother of 4 who lived in that house with her husband. She suffered from depression her entire life and attempted suicide many times. Once, by drowning herself in the upstairs bathtub. Another time, by burning in the fireplace. And every time, her husband was able to stop her. Eventually, she became fed up with him and killed him and threw his body into the river. Racked with grief and self-hatred, she hung herself from the balcony. "How do you know all this?" Anastasia asked her dad's friend. "I saw it. She was my mother." It was the winter of 2013. McCall had just finished his first year of wildland firefighting, and to celebrate, he and his friend Kobe went to his cabin, far off in the woods and mountains of Montana. McCall also bought himself a .44 Magnum revolver, which he brought along with him. McCall and Colby spent the day gathering wood, and once it got dark out, they burned the wood in the fire pit in front of the cabin. They were playing music through a Bluetooth speaker, sipping beers, and hanging out. About 5 minutes had passed when McCall heard a sound coming from behind the cabin. They both paused. It was probably just the wind or something. McCall threw another log onto the fire, and they continued talking. A few minutes later, they heard it again. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, it's probably just some cattle or something." "Cattle don't make noise like that." They tried to think of what could possibly be the source of this strange, almost rhythmic sound. Maybe it was the trees freezing? But it wasn't cold enough for that. The nearest neighbor wasn't for a few miles. Was someone messing with them? "Hey! Who's there?" McCall tried to sound as intimidating as possible, despite being scared shitless. "If you don't stop, I'm gonna shoot." They waited. McCall shot his gun at a nearby tree as a warning. When the ringing in their ears began to fade, they heard a low, deep, guttural growl. McCall knows what all the animals in Montana sound like. Cougars, moose, black bears, badgers, coyotes, wolves. But this? He had never heard a growl like this before, and it sounded like a warning. McCall and Colby ran inside the cabin, locked the doors, and closed the blinds. The following morning, they walked outside to where the sounds came from to see if they could find any tracks, something to give them an idea of what was there. But the fresh fallen layer of snow had covered any evidence. The following summer, McCall and Colby returned to the cabin. McCall's uncle had recently passed away, and a mountain retreat was just what he needed. At this point, they had completely forgotten about the strange sounds last winter. They arrived at the cabin early in the morning and spent the day gathering firewood. Once it got dark, they decided to stop and go inside for a break. McCall made a large pot of coffee to stay awake, as they planned on staying up later to make a bonfire. The living room of the cabin had a couch that faced the front door. Next to the door was a large window with the curtains pulled back. It was completely pitch black outside. McCall and Colby were relaxing on the couch, sipping their mugs, when suddenly, a flash of light appeared outside. Moments later, another flash, and another. With every flash, McCall heard what sounded like the shutter of a camera, like someone was taking photos. McCall turned to Colby. "Do you see that?" The look on his face was enough of an answer. The flashing lights continued for 10 more minutes, and then silence. They heard footsteps, soft, slow, dragging along the ground. Someone was outside of the cabin. They were miles away from anyone else. Somebody had traveled a very long way to get to them. McCall and Colby grabbed their rifles and followed the sound as it made its way to the front door. It stopped. Despite having just drank 2 cups of coffee, McCall began to feel tired, heavy. It was like someone had just switched his brain to slow motion. He could faintly hear Colby say, "I think they're putting something in the air." "McCall? McCall, wake up!" It was morning. McCall was on the floor next to his bed. "How did I get here?" "I don't know, but I woke up in the middle of the hallway." "Do you remember what happened last night?" "I remember the footsteps at the door, and then I think we both passed out. But check this out." They walked downstairs to the living room. Colby pointed towards the front door. Both their rifles leaned neatly against the door, right where they aimed them last night. "Did you put those there?" "No." "Did somebody enter their house? And were they still there?" When they left later that day, there was a black Dodge Ram with tinted windows parked on the mountain, about a mile away from McCall's cabin. It probably wouldn't have caught McCall's eye if he hadn't known so much about the men in black. Since about half a century ago, people who had witnessed UFOs or other unexplained phenomena also claimed to be visited by mysterious men in black suits and ties. Usually these men threatened the witness to never speak of what they saw. These are the Men in Black, an organization whose job is to keep us from knowing what's really out there. Did McCall and Colby unknowingly witness something they weren't supposed to? And did the Men in Black pay a visit to make sure they wouldn't tell anyone? Unfortunately, there's no way to find out for sure. But if this video suddenly disappears with no explanation, I'll let you decide why. Like this video if it gave you the chills, and don't forget to subscribe to Snarled and Slaytrix.
We appreciate each and every one of you who has gotten us past 750,000 subscribers. Help us get to 1 million. Tell your friends about Snarled and share your favorite videos.
If you dare, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, sweet dreams.